It was an ordinary Wednesday morning when Marcus Williams stepped into his backyard, the faint rays of the sun breaking through the canopy of trees above him. He was just like any other working-class man, steady, reliable, and content with the simplicity of his life. His house was a modest, one-story home tucked into a suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and life moved at a comfortable pace. He was a proud homeowner, his backyard his personal sanctuary where he could unwind after a long day's work. His flowers were blooming, the grass neatly trimmed, and there was a quiet satisfaction in taking care of something he could call his own. Marcus had always taken pride in his space. It wasn't much, but it was his. His neighborhood was diverse, a mix of long-time residents and new families who had moved in over the years. There was a sense of camaraderie, even though things were never without their tensions. It was one of those areas where nothing truly exciting ever happened, just a place where people worked, raised families, and lived quiet, unassuming lives. The kind of place where any disturbance was sure to be noticed. Marcus had lived there for the last 15 years, and in all that time, he had never been involved in any kind of altercation or controversy. He minded his business, and his neighbors did the same. That morning, like any other, he was tending to his flowers, pulling weeds from between the rows of neatly planted tulips and marigolds. The soft scent of the earth mixed with the fresh morning air. He paused, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked around, content with the quiet hum of the neighborhood. The distant sound of children playing in the street, the faint rustling of leaves as the wind gently swayed the branches above him, everything was as it should be. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel grateful for the tranquility of his surroundings. It had been a tough year at work, and moments like these reminded him that, despite everything, he still had a lot to be thankful for. But that sense of calm was about to be shattered in a way Marcus could never have anticipated. It started subtly, just the sound of a car rolling into the street. At first, it seemed like any other delivery vehicle or neighbor passing by. However, the sound grew louder as it drew closer, and Marcus noticed that the vehicle, a large white van, slowed to a crawl as it approached his driveway. He didn't recognize the van. It wasn't one of the usual service vehicles he'd seen in the area. It wasn't unusual for contractors or workers to pass through from time to time, but something about the van felt off. It wasn't just its unfamiliarity that caught his attention, it was the two men sitting inside. They were both wearing dark sunglasses, and the way they peered out from behind the tinted windows gave Marcus an unsettling feeling. The van came to a stop in front of his yard. Before Marcus could process what was happening, the passenger side door opened, and one of the men got out. He was a tall figure, his broad shoulders making him look imposing. The man walked toward the gate leading into Marcus's yard, his expression unreadable. Marcus stood still, unsure of what to do. The man approached the gate, then paused, glancing around. As if sensing Marcus's presence, he turned and waved. "Morning," the man called out, his voice loud but not unfriendly. Marcus hesitated for a moment before replying. "Morning. Can I help you?" The man's eyes scanned the property, then returned to Marcus. "We're here about the billboard," he said, his tone casual, as though this was a normal part of everyday life. "The billboard?" Marcus repeated, confused. "I don't know anything about a billboard." The man smiled, though there was something slightly rehearsed about it. "Oh, you're Mr. Williams, right? Yeah, we've got the green light from the city to set up a billboard right here." He gestured vaguely to Marcus's yard. "Should only take a few hours. Shouldn't be any problem." Marcus stared at him, trying to make sense of the situation. A billboard in his yard? No one had mentioned anything to him about it. He'd been living in the neighborhood for over a decade and had never heard of any such plan. And yet, here was this stranger, telling him that it was already approved and that he needed to make way for their project. Marcus's heart rate quickened, a sense of unease spreading through him. "Hold on," Marcus said, his voice tightening. "I don't recall agreeing to anything like that. And no one from the city has contacted me." The man seemed unfazed by the challenge. "It's all taken care of. The city's authorized it. We've got the paperwork right here," he said, pulling out a small folder from under his arm. He handed it to Marcus. "Take a look for yourself." Marcus took the folder, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped through the papers. The documents were filled with technical jargon, but nothing about them looked familiar. There was a letterhead from the city, but no direct correspondence with Marcus, no signature or approval from him. The papers seemed to be part of a larger, more official project, but they didn't belong to him. He felt something cold twist in his stomach. This didn't seem right. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked, his voice low. "I don't recall ever signing anything." The man's smile faltered just for a moment before returning. "No need to worry about that," he said dismissively. "We've got all the necessary permissions." At that moment, Marcus began to feel a creeping sense of dread. It was as if the world he knew, the peaceful, predictable world of his suburban life, was being pulled out from under him. The man gave a little nod to the workers in the van, and suddenly, more men emerged. They were carrying large metal poles and equipment, ready to begin setting up. The reality of the situation hit Marcus like a punch in the gut. This wasn't some minor inconvenience, it was an outright violation of his property. His space was being invaded, and he had no say in the matter. "I need to call the city," Marcus said, his voice rising. "This isn't right. I don't care what papers you have, but I never agreed to this." The man's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more dismissive. "You can call whoever you want, but this is happening today. It's already been approved." Before Marcus could protest further, the sound of tires screeching caught his attention. Another vehicle, this one a police car, pulled up at the end of his driveway. A uniformed officer stepped out, his face impassive as he approached Marcus. "Is there a problem here?" the officer asked, his tone flat. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he looked between the officer and the workers. The officer's presence only deepened the sense of powerlessness that had begun to gnaw at him. The officer had clearly been sent to ensure that nothing would stop the Billboard project. This wasn't just a construction crew showing up on his property, it was a coordinated effort, and Marcus was the only one who seemed to be questioning it. "I don't know what's going on, officer," Marcus said, his voice strained. "But these people are trying to put a billboard on my property without my permission. I don't know anything about this, and I never agreed to it." The officer glanced down at the papers Marcus was holding, then back at him. "Everything checks out," the officer said, his tone condescending. "This is authorized. You need to let them do their work. We've got all the approvals." Marcus's mind raced, the disbelief growing. The words, authorized, and approvals seemed meaningless when he wasn't a part of the decision-making process. He had been left out of the equation entirely, as though his rights had been stripped away without his knowledge. He opened his mouth to argue further, but before he could get another word out, the officer raised a hand. "This is happening today. You're not going to stop it." The finality of the officer's words, combined with the presence of the workers, left Marcus feeling utterly helpless. His own yard, the space where he had nurtured his family and tended to his life, was being taken from him. He had no choice but to step aside as the workers began unloading their equipment, each movement seeming to chip away at the stability of his once peaceful world. Little did Marcus know, this was only the beginning. The workers quickly set to work, unfazed by Marcus's mounting frustration. They began marking out where the billboard would be placed, measuring the space in his yard as though it was just another ordinary project. The officer, standing by, offered no help, only watching with detached indifference. The sun climbed higher into the sky, its heat intensifying as Marcus's mind raced. He felt helpless, a quiet rage building inside him, simmering beneath the surface as he tried to process what was happening. His thoughts swirled with disbelief. How could something like this happen without his knowledge, without any kind of communication or agreement on his part? It was his land, his property, and yet here they were, completely disregarding his rights. A part of Marcus wanted to lash out, to stop the workers right then and there. But what could he do? The police officer, the city officials, everyone seemed to be on the same side, dismissing his concerns. He felt small, insignificant, like his voice didn't matter in the face of bureaucracy. The more he watched, the more he realized that his property wasn't just being encroached upon, it was being stolen from him, piece by piece. He turned to the officer again, hoping for some kind of intervention, some sign of reason. "I don't understand. Why is this happening? You can't just take my property like this. I never agreed to any billboard." The officer looked at him, his eyes cold and unblinking. "You don't need to agree. The city has already given the go-ahead. You're just a part of the process now. It's already decided. But I'm the one who owns the land." Marcus's voice rose, frustration creeping in. "I should have a say in what happens here. This is my home." The officer didn't flinch, didn't seem to care about Marcus's outburst. "It's not up to you anymore. It's a city project. Just step aside and let them do their work. If you have any problems, you can take it up with the city council later. But as of now, this is happening." The dismissiveness of the officer's words cut deep, and for a moment, Marcus was paralyzed with anger and helplessness. His hands balled into fists, the urge to fight back clawing at him, but he knew deep down that he was outmatched. There was nothing he could do. The forces at play were too powerful, too organized. His mind raced for a solution, any way to fight back. But the reality was sinking in. He was powerless. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding, it was a systematic violation of his rights, and the worst part was that no one seemed to care. As the workers moved forward, beginning to stake poles into the ground, Marcus knew he had to act. He couldn't just let this happen. But the question was, what could he do? He didn't have the resources to fight a city-backed project. He didn't have the legal knowledge to take on the system. All he had was his determination, his refusal to back down. He couldn't let them steal his land, his dignity, without at least trying to stop them. His mind turned back to the city officials, wondering how this could have slipped under his radar. There had been no notices, no letters, no public hearings that he knew of. He'd lived in this neighborhood for over a decade, long enough to have witnessed the quiet ebb and flow of local politics, the zoning changes, the new developments. He had been a part of the community, contributing to the local economy, attending town meetings. How could this happen without his knowledge? How could the city have done this to him without giving him any say in the matter? He glanced over at his neighbor, Linda, who had been watching the entire scene unfold from across the street. Her face mirrored his confusion, her brow furrowed in disbelief. She'd lived in the neighborhood for just as long as Marcus, and like him, she had never been informed about any project like this. As one of the workers brought out the metal frame of the billboard, Linda's expression hardened, and she started walking toward Marcus. "What is going on?" she asked, her voice rising with the same confusion and anger Marcus was feeling. "Are they really doing this? Right on your property?" Marcus could only nod. "They say the city approved it. But I never got any notice. No one told me about this." Linda shook her head in disbelief, her eyes scanning the workers who were now setting up the massive billboard frame in the middle of Marcus's yard. The sheer audacity of it left both of them speechless. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was an outright invasion. His personal space, the very heart of his home, was being turned into a billboard site, a public advertisement for some unknown company. And the worst part was that it was happening with the full backing of the city. Linda, who had always been outspoken, stepped up to one of the workers and demanded to see the paperwork. The worker, looking mildly annoyed, passed her the same folder Marcus had been handed earlier. She flipped through it, her eyes scanning the pages with rapid precision. After a moment, she closed the folder and handed it back, her expression grim. "This is insane," she muttered. "This project is part of something much bigger. These billboards, they're not just going up here. They're part of a larger scheme to overtake this whole area. It's all happening without anyone's consent." Marcus felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just a random commercial ad, it was a piece of a larger puzzle, a much darker plan. He had heard rumors about the city's dealings with private companies, the way they had been selling off public spaces for commercial use without consulting residents. But hearing it from Linda, someone who had always been plugged into the neighborhood's grapevine, made it feel all too real. The city was willing to sell out its own people, turn their lives and property into corporate assets without any regard for the individuals who lived there. Marcus's mind raced as the implications began to sink in. The workers were just pawns in this scheme, following orders from higher up the chain. The police officer, too, was just a tool in the city's efforts to push this project through. But the real power lay in the hands of the city officials and The evening sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple as Marcus stood in the yard, still trying to process everything that had happened that day. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the newly erected billboard frame that loomed ominously in the center of his backyard. He had never imagined his peaceful retreat would be the backdrop for something so invasive, so overwhelmingly intrusive. The workers had long since packed up and left, but the weight of their presence lingered. The officer, too, had gone, leaving Marcus to face the new reality of his life, a reality that was beginning to feel alien, as if the world he knew had slipped into some parallel version of itself, one where his rights no longer mattered. Linda had left shortly after the workers finished, but she promised she would help. "We can't let this slide," she said, her words still echoing in his mind. But Marcus was left with the brutal reality that nothing had changed, not really. The billboard was there, and unless he did something, it was going to stay there, an ever-present reminder of the day his life had been upended without warning. That night, sleep didn't come easy. His mind was a storm of thoughts, questions, and anger. How could this have happened? How could the city have allowed such a blatant violation of his property rights? The more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. This wasn't a simple zoning issue or a minor misunderstanding. This felt like a deliberate attempt to strip away his autonomy, to treat his home like nothing more than a commodity to be exploited. It made him sick to think about it. The next morning, Marcus did what he should have done the day before. He called the city hall, hoping to speak to someone who might offer an explanation. But his optimism quickly turned to frustration as he was shuffled between departments, each person he spoke to offering vague answers, passing him off to someone else who might know more. By the time he was transferred for the third time, he was at his breaking point. His patience was worn thin, and his anger, which had simmered quietly since the previous day, began to boil over. "Look, I'm not interested in being transferred again. I want to speak to someone who can tell me why this is happening," he said, his voice tight with the stress of the situation. The woman on the other end of the line sighed. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but there are procedures in place. The approval process is all above board. If you want to file a formal complaint, you can do that through the city's complaint portal." "A complaint portal?" Marcus repeated incredulously. "You want me to file a complaint online? This is my property we're talking about. They've already set up the frame. How is that above board?" There was a long silence on the line before the woman spoke again, her voice devoid of any real empathy. "Sir, I'm afraid there's nothing more I can do at this stage. The project has already been authorized." The call ended abruptly, and Marcus sat back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand as if it could somehow give him the answers he needed. His thoughts were chaotic, bouncing from one theory to the next. Something about this didn't sit right. How could something as huge as a billboard project take place on his property without his consent? And why hadn't he been notified in advance? The more he thought about it, the more it felt like the whole thing had been rushed through, a deal made behind closed doors, with no consideration for the people it would affect. This wasn't just about a billboard, it was about a larger scheme, a system that had been set up to push ordinary people aside for the benefit of big corporations. And Marcus was just one more casualty in that system. He couldn't let it go. Not now. Not when he knew that his fight wasn't just about one billboard, it was about standing up to a system that was willing to trample on the rights of the little guy without hesitation. Over the next few days, Marcus began researching, digging into the city's zoning laws, looking into the companies involved in the billboard project, and reaching out to others in the neighborhood who might know something. It didn't take long before he discovered something disturbing. This wasn't an isolated incident. In fact, it was part of a larger citywide initiative, one that aimed to convert residential areas into commercial spaces, using billboards as a means of corporate advertisement. The city had been quietly approving these projects for months, slipping them through without much fanfare. The more Marcus uncovered, the more he realized just how widespread this issue was. And what was worse, he wasn't the only one who had been left in the dark. Many of his neighbors had no idea that their properties were also slated for similar takeovers. As Marcus continued to dig, he began to uncover the true nature of the players behind the scenes. The city officials were only part of the equation. The real power lay with a network of private companies, developers, and investors who stood to profit immensely from this scheme. These companies had the money, the influence, and the connections to push through projects like this without facing any opposition. The city, hungry for revenue, had sold out its residents to make way for these commercial ventures. The more Marcus learned, the more disgusted he became. This wasn't just about a billboard. This was about a deliberate, systematic effort to reshape the city for corporate gain, to turn homes into revenue-generating assets without a second thought for the people who lived in them. But Marcus wasn't the type to sit back and let this happen. He wasn't going to be another victim of a corrupt system. He began reaching out to local news outlets, contacting reporters who might be interested in exposing the truth. He knew it was a long shot, but he couldn't keep quiet. He had to make people see what was happening, not just to him, but to the entire community. He reached out to his neighbors, too, trying to rally them, to get them to stand with him. It wasn't easy. Many of them were scared, unsure of what to do or how to fight back. The city's actions had left them feeling powerless, just like Marcus had felt when it all began. But some of them, like Linda, were ready to join him in his fight. Slowly, a small group began to form, people who shared his outrage and his resolve to do something about it. One evening, Marcus met with Linda and a few other neighbors at a local coffee shop, the dim lighting and quiet atmosphere providing a sense of comfort amidst the storm of emotions they were all experiencing. As they gathered around the table, Marcus laid out what he had uncovered, the zoning laws, the corporate ties, the network of developers behind the billboard project. Linda listened intently, her face hardening with every new revelation. "I had no idea it was this bad," she said after a long pause. "It's like they've been playing us all for fools." "We have to do something," Marcus replied. "I've been trying to reach out to the press. But we need to get more people involved, more people who care about this neighborhood. This is bigger than just one person or one family. They're trying to take away our homes. If we don't stop them now, they'll do it to everyone." The group nodded in agreement. They knew what had to be done, but the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. The corporations had deep pockets, and the city was on their side. But Marcus's fire had been lit, and he was determined to see this through. This fight wasn't just about a billboard, it was about the future of the community, the right to preserve their homes and their way of life. The next day, Marcus stood in his backyard once again, staring at the billboard frame that had taken over his property. But this time, something was different. He wasn't standing there helplessly anymore. He wasn't just watching it happen. He was ready to fight back. The battle was just beginning. The following days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Marcus had become obsessed with his cause. The initial shock of the invasion of his property had worn off, replaced by a burning resolve to see the fight through. It wasn't just about the billboard anymore. It was about the community, about standing up to a system that had so brazenly ignored the voices of its residents. And as the days went on, the support he had begun to gather started to grow. At first, only a handful of neighbors had joined his cause, people like Linda, who had been just as outraged by what had happened. But as word spread, more and more people came forward, each one with their own frustrations and fears about the way things were going in their city. Soon, they had a small group of activists, neighbors, concerned citizens, and even a few local business owners, rallying behind Marcus. The city, however, was not about to let their lucrative plans slip away so easily. Marcus knew he would have to be strategic. The legal and political systems were set up to benefit those in power, and he wasn't naive enough to think he could just waltz into a city council meeting and win the battle on emotion alone. He needed more. He needed hard evidence. He needed public support. He needed a plan. The first step was organizing a protest. It wasn't much yet, just a small gathering, but it was a start. Marcus had spoken with a few reporters who were intrigued by his story, and they were willing to cover the protest. If they could just get enough media attention, maybe they could sway public opinion. Maybe they could force the city to back down. The morning of the protest, the air was thick with anticipation. Marcus stood with Linda at the front of the group, nervously adjusting his signs and making sure everything was in place. They had planned everything meticulously. There were pamphlets, flyers, social media posts, and even a few press releases to hand out. But there was a sense of unease in the air, a feeling that the city was preparing to push back. As the protesters began to gather, the sound of car horns and the chatter of people filled the air, creating a strange mix of excitement and tension. Marcus felt the weight of the moment. This was it. This was his chance to get the word out, to rally the community to fight back. But as more people arrived, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. The first sign of trouble came when a city police van pulled up to the protest. Marcus froze for a moment, his heart racing. He had expected some pushback from the city, but seeing the police show up so quickly only solidified his worst fears. They were ready for this. They had prepared for it. And that meant they were willing to do whatever it took to crush this movement before it could grow any larger. The officers stepped out of the van, their expressions hard and unreadable. They surveyed the group of protesters, noting who was speaking, who was holding signs, who was being vocal. Marcus was acutely aware of every eye on him, the tension building with every passing second. A young officer approached Marcus, his demeanor cold and professional. "This protest is unauthorized," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You'll need to disperse immediately. If you don't, you'll be arrested for obstructing the streets." Marcus stared at the officer, his anger surging, but he kept his composure. "This is a public street," he replied. "We have every right to be here. We're exercising our First Amendment rights to protest against a blatant violation of our property rights." The officer didn't flinch. "I'm giving you a direct order to disperse. If you don't, you'll be arrested." The threat of arrest hung in the air like a storm cloud. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. Was this really happening? Were they willing to arrest him and his neighbors just for protesting something that was wrong? He knew the risks. Protesting wasn't without consequence, and getting arrested could make things even worse for their cause. But what other choice did he have? If he backed down now, he would be giving up, and he couldn't do that, not after everything he had learned, not after everything that had already happened. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. You can't intimidate us into silence. We have the right to be here, and we're not going anywhere. As the officer prepared to respond, a voice from the crowd shouted, "We won't be intimidated." The crowd erupted in cheers, and suddenly, the protest seemed less like a small, fleeting demonstration and more like a real movement. People rallied behind Marcus, their collective energy growing stronger with every passing moment. The officers hesitated, unsure of what to do next. For a brief second, Marcus felt like he was winning. They had the numbers now, and the pressure was starting to build. But just as the protest began to gain momentum, a white van pulled up beside the police vehicles. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a suit. He was tall, clean-cut, and exuded an air of authority. Marcus recognized him immediately. He was one of the city officials, someone who had been involved in approving the Billboard project. The man's eyes scanned the crowd, his gaze narrowing when he spotted Marcus. He walked over to the officer who had been speaking to Marcus and whispered something to him. The officer nodded and then turned back to the crowd, his expression hardening. "This protest is illegal," the officer announced. "If you continue, you will face serious consequences. You're all now trespassing on private property." Marcus's heart sank. He could feel the tides turning against them. The official had arrived to ensure that the protest didn't get out of hand, and now they were trying to silence everyone with legal threats. The message was clear: if they continued, there would be serious consequences. The protesters were not backing down, but the fear of legal repercussions, the threat of losing everything they had worked for, started to creep in. But Marcus refused to let this be the end. He had come too far to stop now. He turned to the crowd, raising his hand for silence. When the chatter quieted, he spoke, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "This isn't just about one billboard. This is about our rights as citizens. This is about our community. If we don't stand up now, we risk losing everything. We can't let them take our homes, our neighborhoods, our lives. We have to fight for what's right." His words resonated with the crowd. They were scared, but they were also determined. One by one, the protesters began chanting, their voices growing louder with each passing second. "We won't back down. We won't back down." The chant echoed down the street, reverberating in Marcus's chest. It was a cry for justice, for change, for the preservation of everything they held dear. In that moment, Marcus realized something profound: this wasn't just about the billboard anymore. This was about a larger fight, one that extended beyond his backyard, beyond the walls of the city. It was a fight for fairness, for the rights of ordinary people to have a say in the decisions that affected their lives. It was a fight for transparency, for accountability. The protest that day had been a defining moment for Marcus and the growing movement in his community. They had stood their ground, despite the looming threat of arrest, and had shown the city officials that they would not back down. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the energy of people who had finally found their voice. But Marcus knew that the real challenge had just begun. The city had proven it would stop at nothing to bulldoze over the residents, and while their protest had made a statement, it hadn't brought them any closer to victory. The billboard was still there, towering over his backyard, an ever-present symbol of the corporate greed that had infiltrated their community. In the days following the protest, Marcus and his group of activists worked tirelessly to keep the momentum alive. They attended city council meetings, demanding answers, speaking out against the illegal use of eminent domain and the exploitation of residential spaces for corporate advertising. They held additional protests and rallies, bringing more and more people into the fold. Every day, it seemed, they were making progress, but the fight was taking its toll on Marcus. He was exhausted, his sleep disrupted by the constant pressure of knowing that everything he had worked for was hanging in the balance. But every time he thought about giving up, he thought about the faces of the people who had joined him in this battle, the people who believed in what they were doing, who wanted change as badly as he did. That was enough to keep him going. And most importantly, it was a fight for hope. The police officer and the city official stood motionless, watching the protest unfold, but they had no idea what they were up against. The community was coming together, and they weren't going to stop. The tide was turning, slowly but surely, and Marcus could feel the momentum building. But he knew this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, and the battle for his home, for his community, would not be won easily. The stakes were high, and the city wasn't going to let go without a fight. But Marcus had one thing the city didn't: the strength of his neighbors, his friends, and the unwavering belief that they could win. They were no longer just a group of individuals, they were a united front, ready to take on the system and demand the change they so desperately needed. Then came the news that shook him to his core. It wasn't just the billboard in his backyard that had been approved, it was part of a larger project, one that would impact the entire neighborhood. The city had secretly signed a deal with a corporation to turn large portions of residential land into commercial zones, and the billboard was just the beginning. What had started as a small issue had now become a fight for the soul of their entire neighborhood. The company behind the project had already bought up several homes in the area, planning to demolish them to make room for more billboards, shopping centers, and office buildings. It was a land grab, and the residents were the ones who were going to lose everything. Marcus was stunned. He had known the situation was bad, but he had never imagined it was this widespread. His first instinct was to feel helpless, to give in to the enormity of what was happening. But he quickly realized that the only way to stop this was to expose it to the light. They had to rally every person in the neighborhood, every voice they could get, to stand against this corporate takeover. But this time, it wouldn't just be about fighting for his own backyard, it would be about fighting for the entire community. This fight was bigger than he had ever imagined. The following weeks were a whirlwind of strategy meetings and sleepless nights. Marcus and his group of activists reached out to lawyers, environmental groups, and even national media outlets in the hopes of gaining more support. They spread the word online, using social media to amplify their message, and quickly saw a wave of support from people all over the city. News outlets picked up the story, local and national, and the protests grew bigger. People began to show up in droves, chanting for justice, demanding that the city council reverse the deal. But even as the movement gained traction, the fight was becoming increasingly difficult. The corporation behind the project had deep pockets, and the city was more than willing to let them bulldoze over its citizens for a quick payday. It wasn't just about the billboard anymore. The fight had evolved into something much larger. The very nature of their city was at stake. The developers were trying to erase everything that made the neighborhood what it was, its history, its culture, its character. And they weren't going to stop until they had gutted it entirely. Amid the growing protests, a pivotal moment arrived when Marcus was contacted by a former city planner who had worked on the zoning project. The man, who had since retired, had seen the writing on the wall and was eager to talk. The insider revealed something that gave Marcus hope: there were legal loopholes in the deal. The corporation had rushed through the approval process, bypassing certain zoning laws and not properly notifying residents of the changes. There were violations in the process that could be used to challenge the project in court. The revelation felt like a lifeline. It was a small crack in the system, but it was enough for Marcus and his team to latch onto. They hired a team of lawyers to investigate further, and soon they uncovered even more damning evidence. The company had bribed several city officials to fast-track the project, and some of the signatures on the zoning documents had been forged. The more they dug, the more corruption they uncovered. It was a scandal, and it had the potential to bring down the entire city's leadership. With this new ammunition, Marcus and his group took their findings to the press. They released a bombshell report, one that exposed the full extent of the corruption and corporate manipulation behind the project. The news hit hard. Local journalists jumped on the story, and soon it was national news. The public outcry was overwhelming. Residents who had previously been indifferent to the protest now found themselves rallying behind Marcus and his cause. The city officials, who had thought they could ignore the protests and keep pushing their plans through, now found themselves on the defensive. With the public demanding accountability, they had no choice but to respond. The pressure mounted. City council meetings were packed with angry residents, all demanding that the deal be stopped. The company's executives were forced to testify before a public hearing, where they were grilled by reporters and residents alike. It was the first time in weeks that Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. The tide was turning. But the fight was far from over. The corporation didn't give up easily. They began pouring money into advertisements and lobbying efforts, trying to sway public opinion in their favor. They even attempted to bribe more city officials, but this time, their efforts were exposed before they could do any real damage. Every step the corporation took seemed to push the community closer together, and as the weeks went on, the protests grew more powerful, more vocal. The city council was starting to feel the heat. They had no choice but to address the growing scandal. Finally, after months of back and forth, the city council called a vote to decide the fate of the project. It was a tense day, one that would determine whether the residents would be able to keep their homes or if they would be forced to watch as their neighborhood was demolished for corporate greed. As Marcus sat in the council chambers, surrounded by his neighbors, he could feel the weight of the moment. He had come so far, and yet, everything was hanging in the balance. The council members took their seats, and the vote was called. The room was silent as the votes were tallied, and then it happened. The vote passed. The project was officially cancelled. The board members had listened. The power of the people, the voices of the community, had won. Marcus couldn't believe it. After everything they had been through, the protests, the threats, the long hours of work, it had all paid off. They had done it. They had won. The streets erupted in cheers as news of the victory spread. Marcus was overwhelmed with emotion, tears welling up in his eyes as he hugged Linda and the others who had fought beside him. The neighborhood had been saved. The billboard that had once dominated his backyard was taken down, and the company's plans to destroy their homes had been halted. The victory wasn't just about the billboard. It was a victory for every person who had ever felt powerless, for every resident who had been ignored by the city officials. It was proof that when a community came together, when people stood up for what was right, they could change the world. Marcus knew that this victory wouldn't erase all the challenges they had faced. There were still corrupt officials in the city, still threats of gentrification, still the ever-present danger of corporate greed. But for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He had fought for what was right, and he had won. And in that moment, he knew that anything was possible. The victory was bittersweet. Marcus stood in the middle of his backyard, now free from the looming shadow of the billboard that had once threatened to erase everything he had worked for. The air felt different, lighter, as though the community had exhaled together after a long, suffocating battle. But as the immediate celebrations faded and the reality of their success settled in, Marcus couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the victory, while significant, was only one chapter in a much larger story. In the days following the council's vote, Marcus was faced with a flood of media attention. Reporters from local and national outlets reached out, eager to hear about the grassroots movement that had taken down a corporate giant. The interviews came one after the other, each time recounting the same triumphant narrative of a community rising against a faceless corporation. Yet, despite the praise and recognition, Marcus found himself struggling with a quiet unease. The fight had been won, but he couldn't help but feel that the larger fight was far from over. The victory had illuminated the deep cracks in the system, cracks that had allowed this injustice to happen in the first place. It was clear that, for all their success, the community had only managed to stall the machine, not stop it. The city was still in the grips of a transformation that was changing the very nature of their neighborhoods. The developers, though temporarily defeated, hadn't gone away. They were already plotting their next move. They had money, influence, and a network that extended far beyond the city council. Marcus knew they wouldn't give up without a fight. He could see the future of his city being shaped in real time, and it wasn't pretty. The story of the billboard was not unique, it was part of a much larger pattern that had been happening in cities across the country. The encroachment of corporate interests into residential areas, the takeover of small communities by big businesses, the erosion of affordable housing, all of these were issues that needed to be addressed, not just for Marcus and his neighbors, but for every community facing similar threats. But Marcus didn't want to let the victory slip away as just a momentary achievement. He felt a responsibility to the people who had stood by him, to the neighbors who had come together and demanded change. They had won something important, something tangible, and he couldn't allow it to fade into the background. As he sat in his living room, staring at the walls that seemed to have witnessed the entire transformation of his life, Marcus made a decision. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. He reached out to Linda, his closest ally throughout this entire ordeal, and the two of them began to strategize. They wanted to turn their success into a movement, a lasting force that could bring real, sustainable change to their community. They couldn't just fight for their own backyard, they had to fight for every neighborhood at risk of being sold off to the highest bidder. They started meeting with other activists, community organizers, and legal experts who had supported their cause, and together, they developed a plan to expand their efforts beyond just one neighborhood. They were going to build a coalition of communities, a network of people who refused to let developers run roughshod over their homes and lives. They wanted to put pressure on local government officials to adopt stricter zoning laws, to ensure that residents were protected from corporate interests that sought to exploit them. They wanted to fight for affordable housing, for spaces that would remain accessible to everyone, not just those with the deepest pockets. The first step in their new campaign was to create a platform where the voices of ordinary people could be heard. They organized town halls, community meetings, and public forums where residents could come together and discuss the issues they faced. At these gatherings, Marcus and Linda heard stories that broke their hearts, stories of families who had been forced out of their homes by rising rent prices, stories of small businesses that had been driven under by the influx of large chain stores. The more they listened, the more they realized that the issues they were facing in their neighborhood were not isolated incidents. They were part of a national problem. What had happened to Marcus and his neighbors was happening to countless others. And if they didn't act, it would continue happening, one neighborhood at a time. Through these meetings, the community began to form a collective identity, a sense of shared struggle and shared hope. People who had once been strangers were now working together for a common cause. They began to develop a strategy to tackle the underlying causes of the gentrification and corporate exploitation that was spreading across their city. They reached out to national organizations that had been fighting similar battles, learning from their experiences and incorporating their lessons into their own efforts. It was a slow process, but there was a palpable sense of urgency. Marcus knew that time was running out. If they didn't act now, the city would be irrevocably changed, and not for the better. As the months passed, the coalition began to gain traction. They held rallies that drew larger crowds, lobbied city officials to pass legislation protecting renters and homeowners from unjust evictions, and worked with architects and urban planners to develop alternative visions for the future of their city, visions that prioritized the needs of residents over profit. They also began to leverage the media to raise awareness about the dangers of unchecked development. The story of their fight against the billboard became a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance against the corporate forces that threatened to dismantle the fabric of their community. Despite the momentum, the opposition was fierce. The developers weren't going to let their plans be derailed so easily. They launched their own campaign to discredit Marcus and the coalition, painting them as troublemakers and radicals. They flooded the media with advertisements portraying their projects as urban renewal, trying to reframe the narrative in their favor. They even attempted to undermine the movement by offering bribes to local politicians, trying to buy off anyone who stood in their way. But Marcus was undeterred. He knew this fight wasn't just about him, it was about every person who had been left behind by a system that cared more about profits than people. And as long as there was a glimmer of hope, as long as there was a single voice willing to stand up, he would keep fighting. But there were moments, quiet moments, when Marcus found himself questioning everything. The weight of the struggle, the sheer scale of the fight ahead, began to feel overwhelming. He had spent months battling the system, pouring every ounce of energy into the cause, and while the support was growing, so was the resistance. There were days when the road seemed impossibly long, when it felt like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. And in those moments, Marcus remembered the faces of his neighbors, the people who had stood by him from the very beginning, the ones who had believed in him when he was just a man fighting for his backyard. They were the reason he kept going. They were the reason he couldn't give up. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, Marcus received a phone call that would change everything. It was from a city council member who had once been an ally of the developers. The council member had heard about the growing movement and wanted to meet in person. "I've seen what you're doing," the council member said. "And I've been thinking. Maybe it's time for a change." The conversation that followed was one of the most pivotal moments of Marcus's life. The council member was offering him an opportunity to sit down with the mayor and other city leaders to discuss the future of development in their community. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance to push their agenda forward in a way that could have a lasting impact. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Marcus wasn't sure what to expect, but as he walked into the mayor's office, he was ready. The fight was far from over, but the possibility of real change, of real progress, was within reach. This was the moment they had worked for, a chance to not only protect their homes but to create a future where people, not corporations, held the power. As Marcus left the meeting, he couldn't help but feel that familiar rush of hope, the same feeling he had when he first decided to stand up against the billboard. But this time, it was stronger. This time, it wasn't just about one person or one neighborhood. It was about an entire city, an entire movement, that had the power to change the course of their future. Marcus had fought for his backyard, and now he was fighting for the future of his city. And with every step forward, he knew that the fight for justice, for fairness, and for the rights of ordinary people was a fight worth continuing, no matter how hard it might get.